Hello and welcome to Spectrum. As we come to the end of our production on the gendered life cycle, this series focuses on death, memorialization, and how we remember people. I will be focusing on literature, how we remember women in text, and female authors in particular. We often talk about people getting left on the shelf and forgotten, but all too often women are left off the shelves altogether. To get the full picture, I have interviewed a journalist, an academic, and 2 leaders of a book club to understand more about the seeming deaths of women in literature, and why they are so often forgotten. First up then, I will be exploring the surprisingly unfamous author Sulpicia. She is the only extant Roman female author, and yet her work is seldom taught, promoted, or read. Given that multiple male Roman authors are not only translated regularly, but also held up as models of successful poetry, it is essential that we translate the only surviving female poet from her time. Her perspective is invaluable and offers a unique opportunity to have a woman's insight into Roman culture and romance. To find out more about her almost forgotten work, I interviewed Tristram Fane Saunders, who is a journalist with the Telegraph, published and prize-winning poet, and recent translator of Sulpicia's 6 remaining poems. In the foreword to his book, Saunders cites the reason for his translation work. Europe has always looked to the classical world for inspiration. To ignore the one surviving female voice from that culture isn't just lazy, it's unforgivable. Hi Tristram, so can you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hi, my name is Tristram Fane Saunders. I'm a poet and journalist currently living in London. And while I was studying for a creative writing master's up at St Andrews last academic year, I wrote a book called Postcards from Sulpicia, which is kind of a series of loose poetic versions of the complete surviving works of Sulpicia, who's the only extant female writer from ancient Rome, the only female writer whose work still survives to the current day.
Now, very few people have heard of her. Why is that?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for this. Partly that we don't have a huge amount of her work. There are only also that her work comes to us in a slightly odd way. It was included in, I think, the 3rd book of something called the Corpus Tibulianum, which is Tibullus, who was one of the sort of slightly better-known Roman poets. He published these 3 books, and the 3rd one of them is kind of all of his friends and all of the other people in his writing circle. And some of her poems are saved as sort of evidence of part of his writing circle. In her lifetime, she was very successful and popular, and the poems, what confuses the matter is, it seems, people liked the stuff so much, they effectively wrote Sulpicia fanfiction. They wrote other poems in her voice, or wrote poems about her and about how cool she is, of which we have a couple. So that blurred the issue for a little while, in that scholars still debate a bit. Like, there are 6 that we think we know are by her, and there are 7 which we think are mostly not by her, largely because they're writing about her in the 3rd person, and a couple of them are saying how nice she looks. And just myself, I think your average poet tends not to do that. But it's been blurry for a very long time about which ones exactly are and aren't by her, and so for a long time, and this is terrible, the kind of for a few hundred years, once her work was rediscovered, the schools of thought kind of went one of 2 ways. On the one hand, you have male academics saying, this poetry is great, and therefore cannot possibly be by a woman. And on the other hand, you have male academics saying, this poetry is by a woman, and therefore cannot possibly be great. And for a long time we were kind of stuck in this rut. So that is perhaps one of the reasons why her work has been overlooked.
Interesting. Do you think this is a recurring theme throughout literature? Do you think we are more likely to dismiss the work of female authors?
I think, well, if you just look historically, certainly we have been for a lot of the past. Or at least, not if not to dismiss, at least to oversimplify, or to try and find ways of making it fit in with our received ideas at any given moment of history of what we feel a woman should be. So there's a lot of there's if you look at the way that Sappho's been translated since sort of well the Renaissance actually, and it's an interesting case because there's very little to work with. Whereas with Sulpicia we have six totally complete poems in a sequence. It's like a sort of an EP, a mini album. With Sappho it's much more fragmentary, so there's a lot of guesswork. There's a lot more room for the individual translators to put their own stamp on things, and you see people sort of rewriting her work in ways to try and make her sort of I mean, there are some translations which try and make her the perfect Victorian gentlewoman, and it's interesting seeing how when we do pay attention to female writers, when I say we, I mean largely male translators looking at sort of people writing in other languages. There can be a desire to fit them to a certain time, as in well our time, to make them sort of take on our values. And to a certain extent, I think that's unavoidable. Whenever anyone is translating anything, it's always going to carry the imprints of how we see the world, in the same way as if you get the fish to translate the book, it will end up wet. But I think if you go into it with a kind of awareness that that's what you're doing, and present it to the reader saying, I have sort of altered this unavoidably because of who I am and when I'm writing, I think that's a bit more honest than suggesting that what you're presenting is the absolute thing. But all of this, like I've said so far, is really applying particularly to writing in translation, just because there's so much more scope to kind of to change your perspective on the original.
You mentioned as well, Sulpicia was quite popular during her own lifestyle. Is that then surprising that she got so quickly forgotten?
I mean, in in a sense, she's one of the lucky ones, in that the well, most of the Roman writers, because there were thousands of them, are lost. We have nothing. We have hundreds of names that just
So there could be
slip
thousands
by.
of Sulpicias that they just haven't been
Absolutely.
handed down
Actually,
to us.
interesting you say that. There are two.
Ah.
There are two. There were living at slightly different times, about a generation and a half apart, 2 generations apart. There were two poets called Sulpicia, who it's from. We have a line and a half by the other one, which is tragic. There's a writer, and all that survives of her work is like a line and a half, and it roughly translates as filling in some of the missing words, but not much, just in terms of the phrasing of it. It's like through the sort of bed slats or mattress, it's unclear. Like sort of through the like slightly in some way worn out or damaged bed, uh, it might be seen my body moving above his, which is wonderful. But you kind of wish we had the rest of the poem. But it seems the second Sulpicia, uh, who was actually known as Sulpicia the satirist, because she kind of this is also how she's put in parlance. So the Roman satire is kind of different to how we see it now. It's a lot more moralizing openly a lot of the time. Still sometimes quite funny. She was seen as relatively conservative in her values. There's a poem, I forget who it's by now, but there is one say with the opening line is everyone should read Sulpicia, because it's she will tell you how to lead your life in a virtuous way. And when people found this, for a while we thought it was about the earlier Sulpicia, who we have more work by, the contemporary of Tibullus, but it seemed a really odd way to write about what she was writing, and people eventually twigged that it was talking about the other later writer. Okay, to go back to your question after a slight digression about why it is that she was popular in her lifetime and then rapidly less popular afterwards, even nearly forgotten. Like I said, she's kind of one of the lucky ones in that her work is comparatively well known. I say comparatively compared to the ones that we've lost, but particularly with poetry, most people are sort of playing the long game, aiming to create something that will, there's that line in Horace where he says, as I've made a monument sort of more lasting than bronze. This aim to create something that will last beyond you is one that drives a lot of writers, but very, very few of them have. And just if you look at most popular writers through time, they cease to be popular or become diminishingly popular after they're dead, and that's sort of largely the way it works, particularly with poetry, because it's for a lot of it seems to have a short shelf life. But if you make something good, overall, I think the quality just often will last. If people find it and love it, they will continue to pass it on. But in terms of having sort of mainstream sort of name recognition, that's a lot rarer, and that's driven by things like the academy and what poets make it onto reading lists at school and university, and that's a very big factor. So frequently, the ones that people end up reading are the ones they've been told to read. But the ones people discover for themselves can retain a kind of cult popularity. A really good example of this is there's a writer called Edna St. Vincent Millay, who was really writing at her peak in the sort of early 1920s, and she was she was from the United States. She moved to New York and became very well known there. She basically wrote one excellent poem which won a national poetry prize, called, I forget, it's either Renaissance or Renaissance. It means sort of like coming back to life. And it's this sort of dream vision of being hurled down into the earth and then going back up to life again. And it's wonderful and really trippy. And that kind of, at the time, it was a very big prize. That kind of made her quite well known very abruptly. And then she kept writing, and the stuff that she wrote was really daring. In that she was openly bisexual at a time when pretty much nobody was, and she wrote these often quite slightly raunchy love poems, great poems about death as well. There's basically there's one critic who said that the two strings on her bow are love and death, but she knows how to play them. She wrote these sort of wonderfully bitter love poems, frequently basically saying, and the bitterness is sort of directed at the passing of time more than anything else and the knowledge of death. In a lot of them follow the same kind of gist of, oh well, I want you, I need you, I can't quite remember your name, and I certainly won't care about you in the morning, but I need you now because I need people around me. And there's this kind of which is a feeling that I think a lot of people can connect with today, but at the time it was very slightly shocking. But one of the interesting things she did, and you see it's actually a thing a lot of female writers do, is kind of a if they're trying to put across a slightly transgressive message or a message that sits against the social mores of the time in any way, they'll frequently adopt a slightly older diction or a kind of form that implies comfort and familiarity as a way of sneaking through something a bit more daring. And this is something that Edna Smithson Millay did a lot in particularly her sonnets. She wrote a lot of sonnets, and she throws in kind of Shakespearean archaisms. You get the thous and dies from time to time. And so you feel that you're being slipped something that seems very familiar, and it works both ways. It reminds you that actually, as a sort of as a reader at the very beginning of the 20th century, a lot of Shakespeare's sonnets don't quite sit in with your comfortable ideas of what people should and shouldn't do. But she brings, I think Edna Vincent Millay's best sonnets are considerably better than some of Shakespeare's worst. She's now kind of fallen by the wayside. She tends not to be mentioned that much. A few of her sonnets still make it into the anthologies, but among a lot of poets, her name is a really handy go-to reference point for particular kinds of great writing. But in terms of mainstream recognition, she doesn't have that much. But that's sadly the case with a lot of writers.
But it is nice to think that these female authors are out there to be discovered,
Mm. And
and they are still there. But you're right, so much of it does come down to university reading lists, what you're told to read, and the rest of it. So perhaps more effort is needed there to actually include these authors in a wide variety.
And the good thing is, I think it's happening. And partly, I mean, these changes happen on a very gradual level, but because now we have far more, particularly female academics, writing about female authors than we did before, this kind of, it sort of slowly expands that sort of light from being one very, very small focus on a handful of male writers to acknowledging a much broader canon. And it's only very recently, in the last couple of years, that we've had a sort of full-length book on Sulpicia's reception through the years, which is wonderful. It's called Reading Sulpicia from 1475 to 1990, which is quite a spread. It's edited by Matilda Skole, that's Skole, and it's in the St Andrews University Library, if anyone listening to this wants to check it out.
Fantastic. And there are still some copies, potentially, of your book available online? There might still be some?
At the time of recording, there are 4 copies left. Postcards from Sulpicia is published by Tapsaltiri Press. If it sells out, you should buy Fiss by Stuart Sanderson instead, also published by Tapsaltiri Press, because it's really, really good Scottish poetry.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much, Tristram, for giving your time, and I would seriously encourage listeners to look up his book, Postcards from Sulpicia. There's a link to it in the description, as well as some to his own poems. Next up, we have an interview with 2 founders of a feminist book club right here in St Andrews, where this podcast is based. Why are women forgotten? How are women memorialised in literature? Is the process of publication getting any easier? Hi guys, can you introduce yourselves to us?
I'm Taylor Folland. I'm a 3rd year at St Andrews, and I study medieval history and art history.
I'm Rebecca Mitchell. I'm a 2nd year at St Andrews, and I study international relations and social anthropology.
Awesome. How did you guys meet?
We met from the St Andrews women's football team.
Nice.
Actually. Yeah, we're both on the first team, so lots of fun times there.
Lots of fun.
Brilliant. And you are now starting a feminist book club, is that right?
Yes. We had been talking about feminist literature that we loved, and at football socials. And then it just evolved into something like really serious and not casual.
Something we could actually do and bring out to the St Andrews community, which is super cool.
And why do you think it's needed?
I think that there's something to say for creating different spaces for people to discuss feminism, because I feel like certain ways can be daunting for others, and literature provides a really cool avenue to do so. And also just generally the kind of inequality towards female authors and female literature needs to be addressed, and I think this is a really great way to do so, and to do it in the St Andrews community is wonderful.
Nice. So do you think that historically women have been less recognized as authors, and if so, why do you think that might be?
100%. Well, we clearly have had concrete barriers in the past. Access to education, being able to turn writing into a profession, income inequality, and like being able to afford to be a writer.
A room of one's own.
Yeah. So I think that although these barriers have been slowly broken down over time, and we're not in the same place we were 500 years ago, that still affects us, and we are still suffering from the repercussions of this severe inequality that women have faced throughout history. So, of course, women have experienced like the feelings of being rejected and being forgotten, because we have, and we still do to an extent, value the masculine more, and value men more, and value what they have to say more.
Do you think we see men as the normal place to start, and beyond that as an exception?
Yes, I think when we code literature, we consider what is male, what is white, what is heterosexual, what is upper middle class to be what's normal. And then when you change one attribute, it becomes not for everyone, but just for a certain group. So when you have either a female author or female character, it becomes marketed or considered for women instead of for everyone. Or when you have 2 women who are in love in a book, it becomes marketed towards only women who are interested in dating women. Whereas if you have a man writing about a heterosexual relationship, that's considered something that everyone can relate to and experience.
What inspired your first choice?
So our first choice is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I first read it not too long ago over winter break, actually, but the moment I read it, I just feminist book club flashed in my head, It's an excellent book. It's an easy read and it's a really enjoyable read, which I think is kind of paramount for a first book to kind of bring people in, just because feminist or not, like literature lover or not, you're gonna enjoy this book's story, and the protagonist is so intriguing. And it's dystopian, which is really like in right now. I think it has a lot of connections to people nowadays, even though it was written 30 years ago. And so it's a really easy and like great way to kind of get your feet wet with kind of feminist literature and ideas about gender that have been written about by women and maybe not as understood. I mean, The Handmaid's Tale was like removed from high school education programs in the U.S., so it's definitely not seen the light of day as much as it probably should.
Do you think that we are making any progress, or do you think that there are still many barriers, or both? Do you think there are barriers but still some progress?
I think there's definitely both. I think that we were talking about historical barriers and how those need to be addressed. And but we shouldn't take our progress for granted. So I was looking up prizes in literature in order to kind of gauge how much we have progressed, and that is a biased field. But when you look at the Nobel laureates for literature in the past 15 years, 5 of them are women and then 10 of them are men. And when I read that, I thought it was really exciting. I was like, wow, 5. But it's interesting that I'm excited about a third. So, yes, there's progress. Yes, we have more women. Yes, they're getting more recognition. But it's not equal and it's not enough. And we still have a lot to do and a lot to read.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it.
That's a great note to end on as well. So do you think hopefully the aim with the book club is that women will be remembered in literature? They will not be forgotten.
I mean, I know the St. Andrews community is small, but if there's any way we can put forward more women in literature and just foster that field, I think that's just the starting point of getting anywhere.
Thanks so much for your time, guys. If you have questions or comments for them, then please post below, or if you're based near St. Andrews, make sure you come along to their first book club on the 6th of March. Do you think there is a gendered aspect to writing, publication, or the creation of characters? Perhaps we have progressed past that point. Whatever your view on this, it's hard to argue with the historical reality of women's exclusion. To conclude this episode, I talked to Julia Prest, an academic focusing on early modern French theatre, about her views on how gender dynamics shaped the early modern literary world. Hello, so could you introduce yourself to me and let me know about the area that you specialise in?
Hi there, my name is Julia Prest and I work in the French department at the University of St Andrews, as you know. I specialise in early modern French theatre in particular. I have an interest in opera and ballet, but I think we're having this conversation today perhaps on the strength of the work that I've done on gender and that I'm continuing to do up to a point. I've written a book on cross-casting and the performance of gender in theatre during the period of Louis XIV, more or less, and there too looking at ballet, spoken drama and opera. And I basically took as my starting point the well-known fact that English drama was performed in Shakespeare's day by all-male casts, whereas in France casts became mixed much earlier. So I was quite interested in the more exceptional status of cross-casting, that's to say men playing female roles or occasionally women playing male roles, and so that sparked my interest in various elements relating to gender and how that works in the theatre.
Brilliant, very interesting. And in terms of gender, do you have a kind of like working definition or any thoughts on it as a construct?
I have a few thoughts.
The
The main thought is that it is distinct from sex, which we tend to use to refer to biological sex. I also have some thoughts about that, which we don't need to go into now particularly, but if sex is biological, and there are generally two sexes, and you're generally born into one or other, though that comes with many footnotes. Gender is a much more fluid term and covers what we might call a spectrum, from hyper-femininity at one end to hyper-masculinity at the other end. And the important thing for me about gender is that it doesn't match neatly onto biological sex at all. So male and masculine need not match up at all, female and feminine need not match up at all either. I think one of the questions that's interesting about gender is the extent to which it's a choice, an individual choice, and the extent to which it's imposed by society, and people obviously have differing views about that. And the other question I find particularly interesting about it is the notion that perhaps we perform our gender, not saying that we necessarily do, but it's quite an interesting notion to play around with and to explore.
Yes, absolutely. And it seems to me that gender's ideas have an impact on literature. Women sometimes seem to be absent. Why do you think it is that there are less or fewer well-known female authors from the early modern period?
I think it's fairly easy to account for this in general terms. The reasons are fairly obvious in the sense that, as you know, women had restricted access to education. There were very clearly defined gender roles in place, though there were always exceptions to those. It was certainly a patriarchal society and arguably a misogynistic one. So in that sense, it's not a surprise that we struggle perhaps to find as many women authors as we might like. I think it's true that some deserve to be uncovered who have remained covered, but there are many who never actually wrote for those reasons. So I tend to see female authors from the time as exceptions, rather than exemplars. They're not on the whole blazing a trail for others to follow, though perhaps in the course of time it can look like that, but they're more exceptional. But there are quite a few exceptions.
Can you give me some examples of where the exceptions are?
Yes, as you know, I work mostly on theatre, but to start with, perhaps the most famous female author of the period that I work on is Madame de Sévigné. As we call her, though, I'm thinking about this and thinking we should call her Sévigné in the same way that we call male authors by their surnames. She's a very famous, well-known, and I would say canonical writer of letters. So if somebody were interested in letters of the 17th century, they would definitely, without hesitation, go to Sévigné as quickly as they would go to any male author. So she's an important one. The other particularly well-known example in prose fiction is Madame de Lafayette, or Lafayette, who's recognised as the author of the first, arguably, French novel, La Princesse de Clèves, though there are also scholars who think that this may have been a collaborative work that perhaps involved some collaboration from male authors as well, but it's attributed to her. So I would say that in letters and prose fiction, there are more female names to uncover than there are perhaps in theatre, which is my primary interest. Theatre's a really interesting case in 17th century France because it is dominated by three names: Molière for comedy, and Corneille for comedy a bit too, but mostly for tragedy, and Racine for tragedy. And French theatre is still seen primarily in this period in relation to these three names, so people look for Molière-esque elements in comedies by other authors, be they male or female, and likewise they look for Cornelian or Racinian elements in tragedies written by male or female authors. So it's quite an interesting case in the sense that both male and female authors suffered because of this sort of towering influence of these three greats. I would say that women suffered more, of course, because it was just that much harder for them to make their names, both at the time and since then. But it would be unfair to suggest that male authors haven't suffered a bit from that as well. So it's partly to do with the canon formation, which is obviously in this case hyper-male, but it doesn't just affect female playwrights, it affects male ones as well.
Yeah, and I suppose there's kind of different intersections that it must affect in terms of like race and sexuality, and who has access, as you say, to resources, but then also to actually becoming part of this canon of literature.
Yeah, so the question arises, are these people there to be uncovered, and should they be made canonical, if we think the canon's a good thing, which is another conversation, or are we overlooking people who we shouldn't be overlooking? or are they just not there? I suppose that's one of the questions.
Do you think there are female authors who deserve greater attention?
I do definitely. In my field, there are a couple of names that spring to mind, who actually interestingly wrote both prose fiction and theatre, but I'm particularly interested in their theatre. So there's someone called Villedieu, well that's what she called herself, Madame de Villedieu, though that wasn't strictly her name. She's also known as Mademoiselle Desjardins, which was her birth name, I think. She's the first female playwright in the 17th century to have had a work performed before the king, before Louis XIV. So that's an important point, I think, in the history of female playwrights. The play was Le Favori. It was basically a comedy. It was labelled a tragicomedy, but it's essentially a comedy, and it was performed by Molière's troupe. So that's quite interesting that she was being performed by the main troops as well. So I'd say she's pretty important. The other name that springs to mind is Catherine Bernard, who was the first female playwright to premiere at the Comédie Française. She came a little bit later than Desjardins. So I would like these to be slightly more household names than they currently are, but they too, all the criticism I read about them, and there isn't that much, tends to see them always in relation to Molière, Racine, Corneille, and maybe we need to get away from that in order to valorise them as well.
Interesting. Do you think in terms of these problems there's a way of fixing this within university courses?
I think that's a really good question, and I ask myself that question quite often, is what can I do? What's the best way to address this problem? One of the questions, as you know, is should we have dedicated courses to female authors? I think there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question. I think it depends on the authors themselves, it depends on the nature of the course, it depends what you're trying to do and what you're trying to look at. I certainly think that there is still a place in the university curriculum for courses dedicated to female authors, particularly when they're female authors who are writing as female authors. So, as you know, there's a sort of courant of particularly novelists from the 20th century who say, I write as a woman. I think it's quite interesting to read them as female authors because that's what they're inviting us to do and that's what they're saying that they're doing. With some authors in a period, perhaps more recent periods, they might prefer to be studied and might be better studied just as authors, so integrated alongside male authors completely indiscriminately. So there could be a case for suggesting that you don't even mention the sex or gender of the author, depending what it is that you're trying to do in the course. With my lot it's tricky because often as exceptions they are trying to make their way to a certain extent by writing like men, which obviously blurs the issue a little bit if you're approaching them as female playwrights. That said, I have read articles that suggest that my playwright Villedieu, for instance, she writes like a man in that she's derivative in some respects, and she out-Corneilles Corneille at times in her portrayal of excessive heroism. So she's more male than a male author, if you like. But there are suggestions that you could discern in her, not in her writing style, but in her characterization, perhaps the influence of her gender on her portrayal of very strong female characters. But in 17th century France, a strong female character was seen as masculine. So I'm not sure we're doing her a great service necessarily by viewing it through that lens. But I think it's interesting to play around with that as a possibility. So I guess I would say, by all means have courses dedicated to female authors. By all means integrate them. That's true equality, I think, actually, is to integrate and not make any distinction depending on the works. But if people are writing as women, then we need to perhaps to consider them as female authors.
Yeah, I think that's very true. But when trying to implement this, do you come across problems, or have you ever come across problems?
I have. Let me give you one anecdote. So I offer a course here called Aspects of Gender in 17th century French theatre, and for obvious reasons I wanted to include one of my female playwrights. I thought perhaps the most interesting play that I'd come across by a female playwright so far was a tragedy called Nitétis by Villedieu. This one features very, very strong female characters who are not only vying with Corneille for the strength of their portrayal, but they actually vie with each other. There's an interesting sort of female rivalry, and there are quite weak male characters as well. I'm not saying that's because it was by a female author, but it is just an interesting phenomenon, and I think it's a good tragedy in its own right. So that was an obvious choice for me for this course. However, when I looked into it, I could only find the play in an anthology dedicated to female playwrights. So that comes back to that question of should we have dedicated anthologies. I think it's great that they're out there, but the problem was I couldn't find a single sole edition of the play, and I couldn't obviously ask students to buy the anthology. So I tried to make a pedagogical point out of this difficulty. I tried to convince students that the very fact that they had to go to the library, read the play in the library, possibly make a photocopy of dubious legality of the play was in some way a useful lesson to learn about the status of female playwrights at the time and even today. And I think they got the point, but they found it quite irritating and inconvenient, and most of them said in the feedback form that although they quite enjoyed Nitétis, it was really inconvenient and they didn't want to have to do that in subsequent modules. So I'm sorry to say that I actually did take it off the syllabus, and I completely understand the student's point of view, but it was with regret that I had to pull a text that I thought was interesting in its own right, but also important to include, particularly in a course that was on gender.
Yeah, definitely. Can I just ask as well, sorry, for your first thoughts on, do you think, broadly speaking, it's very difficult to mark progress, of course, but do you think we are making progress? Do you think we're paying more attention to these issues?
I do. I think, broadly speaking, we have to say that we have made progress. I think that would be quite difficult to deny. I wouldn't claim that we're there yet. This is going off at a tangent perhaps a little bit, but if you even look at sort of the question of gender equality in academia, there are plenty of examples where it's clear that we have not achieved that, and I think that's part of a broader picture whereby we have made progress, but there is still further progress to be made. There are notoriously few female professors in modern languages, for instance, here, and we know that salaries for female academics tend to be lower than for male academics. So I think this is also reflected in what's happening in what we're teaching. But yes, we are making progress. I suppose we're also now addressing different issues, well, things that you raised, like race, and in fact that's something that I'm working on now, and that doesn't mean we've ticked the gender box and we now move on to race, but they're all part of a bigger picture where we need to try to address any discrepancies and any inequalities for whatever reason that they might arise.
Okay, wonderful. Do you have any final thoughts, anything you'd like to throw out that I haven't asked you?
Let's just keep on progressing.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Prest, for taking the time to be interviewed by us, and to all our contributors for shaping this episode. What are your own views about the death of women in literature? Has the problem been solved, or is it an ongoing battle? Let us know what you think, and make sure to stay tuned for more through our Facebook, Twitter, and blog. From all at Spectrum, thank you for listening.